In our last lecture, we took a look at the economics behind coercive labor. In this case, the economics behind the system of slavery that's going to become prevalent in the American colonies. So what we're going to be taking a look at here are more social aspects, with an eye towards why slavery really became so common in British North America, more specifically the southern portion. Now, initially, indentured servitude was the preferred method of getting forced labor. You know, someone signs a contract for 4 to 7 years, you generally get 7 years of service out of them. As time goes on, fewer and fewer Europeans are going to be willing to subject themselves to 4 to 7 years of hard labor to pay off their debts or pay off their voyages. So chattel slavery, which simply means that the children of slaves are enslaved, is going to be viewed as the most viable option. You know, that's what we mean by slavery becomes hereditary. It's passed down through generations. Native Americans were very likely to escape because they understood the terrain, it's their homeland, and white indentured servants could more easily disappear into colonial societies due to their skin color. And additionally, by the end of the 1600s, and you hate to break it down to the economics of it, but the reason you see $3 signs is because a slave who was, inherently forced to work for life was 25 to 30 pounds. And pounds is a unit of money. So it costs 25 to 30 pounds to purchase a slave, while a servant of 4 to 7 years was 15 pounds. So unfortunately, in the long run, many found it more economical to purchase slaves. And fewer indentured servants also meant that there would be fewer eventual freedmen who might be likely to rebel against the landed elite. Now, this also begs the question of why West Africa was the region of the world that was forced to provide the labor. Now, it says trading system in place. For generations, it was very common for African tribes to keep prisoners of war as slaves, and they would often sell these slaves to Arab traders who transported them in camel caravans across the Sahara Desert. So if you remember the map from the previous lecture, that's what the Trans-Saharan route is for. Legitimately transported in these camel caravans across the Sahara Desert. Many slaves who were transported from Africa came from different tribes. And with different tribes, you don't always have a common language or common custom, and you also have internal rivalries that are in place. Many of these tribes and kingdoms were pitted against each other for economic gain. So there was incentive to compete and capture individuals from rival kingdoms. That's what we mean by division exploited. Now, inherited malaria resistance is actually most prevalent in West and Central African societies, and individuals from this region of the world demonstrate something to the effect of a 97% immunity to one type of malaria and are also very resistant to another strand of it. Repeated childhood exposure meant that they were more likely to survive the disease in the South and just continue working. And then when it says religious discrimination, from the beginnings of slavery within what became the United States, there was a religious justification to using African slaves, since most West African societies were not Christian and were thus viewed as uncivilized. So, this combination of factors kind of helps explain why West Africa was made to provide the labor force for this system. So with regard to how it changed society, mainly in the South, but that's not to say it wasn't in the North. Nearly every single colony legalized slavery or allowed it at some point. But there wasn't much need for it in the North on the scale that we see in the South because there were abundant economic opportunities. And the northern states that did allow the practice did phase it out over time. Ben Franklin even owned several slaves during his lifetime, but he eventually became an abolitionist, meaning he wanted slavery to end immediately, and he argued against the practice on economic grounds. Now, some masters early on did treat their slaves more like indentured servants and freed them, while others were allowed to acquire property and livestock. Selling these items allowed them to perhaps buy their freedom and purchase tools required to become free planters. So that's what we mean by limited economic opportunities. There were some minor, small chances, and this wasn't necessarily the rule, but it was something that wasn't entirely unusual in the early, maybe even to mid 1600s. That begins to change in the late 1600s. And, Africans grew in numbers during this time, and the mass importation of their culture kind of alarmed their masters who, they kind of feared that they would band together for their freedom. So this is where we start to see the prevalence of what became known as slave codes. Now, the slave codes are designed to restrict the movement of slaves and limit their chances to acquire property. Now, they vary from colony to colony, from town to town, but by and large, we see that there are laws against slaves gathering in groups of over 4 to assemble. There are laws against traveling without paperwork, and if you are traveling from one place to another, there might be armed militia patrolling the countryside asking to see your papers. And it was illegal to own firearms. The days became longer, and the work week ended up being 6 days for most. Sometimes there was work on Sunday. And as such, with this change towards more harsh measures, it says pain and fear. With an indentured servant, if they don't do what they're told, add more time onto their service. You can't do that with someone who's enslaved for life. So misbehavior is going to be punished with whippings and other tortures. Some runaways had limbs or parts of their body removed. And the death of a slave from excessive punishment just would not lead to any legal repercussions for a master. So by and large, it's not a good situation. Although the thing that many masters feared the most occasionally would flare up. During our time frame, the largest of these rebellions that was feared took place in South Carolina. So, the fear was always present, but September 1739, a pretty large one broke out about 20 miles from Charlestown. 20 slaves killed the owner of a store and seized guns and ammunition. They marched south beating drums and chanting "Liberty." 7 plantations were burned, and 20 occupants in these plantations were killed in the process. Now, 100 members of the militia surrounded and killed most of the 80 participants in the slave revolt. 30 made it into the woods, where they were killed within a month. You can see from the sign, they marched towards promised freedom in Spanish Florida. None of them made it. They would have been free had they made it to Spanish-occupied territory. And, this was the exception to the rule. Most slave revolts were very unsuccessful. But the sheer thought that it could happen, the fact that there was a measure of success with this Stono Rebellion, taking place on a branch of the Stono River, that meant that the crackdown on the slaves who did not participate was that much worse.